Podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam. This is All Across America. Daniella, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark.
So I wanted to start off the way you signed off the book. You signed off as your friendly neighborhood intelligence officer, Captain Daniella Mestyanek, young scholar of cults, extreme groups, and extremely bad leadership. You've been involved with a number of cults. Some would consider absolute cults. Some would consider possibility of cults. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in a pretty famous cult, the Children of God. That's the one that Joaquin and River Phoenix and Rose McGowan grew up in, and a founding member of Fleetwood Mac joined and used his, music to ply their trade all around the world. My mom was born into it too, so I'm 3 generations into this cult. My mom having me at the age of 15 because it was a sex cult. I got myself kicked out when I was 15. I was never kind of going along with it. I was always just a prisoner of these people. And so I get kicked out at 15. I put myself through high school, which is crazy because I've never been in the real world, and then college. And then I decide to join the Army as a military intelligence officer. Now, the intelligence officer is first of all, it's the one that gets to question everything. So that was fun for me. But it is the expert on the bad guys. And being in the 2010 timeframe during the 20-year so-called war on terror, that means I became a, government highly trained expert on counterterrorism. And
Right.
I think we have 3 groups kind of at the extreme edge of groups, which are cults, terrorist groups, and gangs. And then I would add armies into that as well, right? So my first day in basic training in the US Army, I was like, oh, this is a cult. Okay, I'm going to be good at this, right? So I did 6.5 years in the Army. I was one of the first women on a deliberate ground combat team, like a mixed gender combat team in the Army. And then I got out of the Army and ultimately ended up doing a master's at Harvard in organizational psychology. And this was when I realized I have always been focused on the bad guys. I understand tyrants and authoritarians and cult leaders and bad groups and how they manipulate people. So I think I'm just going to stay doing that. And, knitting and talking about bad guys. That's my whole thing on social media. And it's a wild time to be an expert on the bad guys.
There's a lot of them out there. And so you talked about terrorists, you talked about gangs, you talked about the traditional cults as we know them. What's the difference between the 3? And I'd imagine there's a lot of crossover.
There is a lot of crossover. And honestly, I think sometimes the difference between what we call a cult and what we call a gang is just race and class in America, right? Gangs, you definitely see more people being forced in and being forced to commit violence. Terrorist groups, of course, we usually define because they are committing violence, as their means of controlling people. And something that actually the Epstein saga helped me put into words. I think when we call something a cult is when we see people participating in their own exploitation, supposedly sort of for free and at their own behest. But really, what it all boils down to is cults are all about labor. Cults are organized crime. You're just not being forced into it. You're doing it of your own volition.
That's what I find to be so fascinating about cults is the concept of that charismatic leader who can convince, encourage through means of their words to abandon their family, abandon their livelihood, abandon everything they ever knew to essentially submit themselves to forced labor. How does that happen?
Brainwashing, right? So love bombing, very important part of brainwashing, which is giving you the pleasurable experience, right? I think that military recruiters, they're the love bombing, right? When they
Oh,
talk
yeah.
to you about the military, it's all about you. It's all about how great this is going to be for you and your career, and you're going to get to do XYZ. You can even be an astronaut. And then the first thing the drill sergeants tell you at basic training, right, is we don't care what your recruiter said. You're ours now,
Yeah.
right? So there's this like bait and switch with love bombing. It's to get you in. And then brainwashing, usually very intense experience. People don't remember it as brainwashing, but all brainwashing is to get you to stop asking questions, to get you to just stop asking questions with a series of mostly language techniques, thought stopping techniques, and isolation and being surrounded by other people and all these different tactics that I talk about in my new book, The Culting of America. And it's really just to get you to stop questioning so that you are sort of this little walking, dancing meat puppet that they can send out in the world to do labor and sort of whatever their goal is, right? They're trying to make you into a deployable agent to help them achieve their end goals.
How is your experience different because you didn't have any choice, whereas your grandfather came into the cult. He under his own volition, he decided to do that. How is your experience different in that you're somebody who may want to question it just because you're a teenager at the time versus somebody who did come in under their own volition? Are the children of cult members love bombed in that same way? Like how are they handled? That
So there's
second
a lot
generation.
of disagreement on this by experts, but most of them are not cult babies. So I
Right.
believe very, very strongly that you cannot brainwash young children. I believe that we buy into our own indoctrination, right? So when I was in the Children of God, nothing could make me believe it or get with the program, and they tried. But when I joined the US Army, I was the first one to be like, "Daniella, you signed up for this. Like, yes, this is crazy, but you signed up
Right.
for this." Right? And we just don't have the rational capacity to push ourselves beyond the rational or to rationalize the irrational until we're probably between the ages of 10 and 14. So a lot of cults will realize they need to break the teenagers. They need to love bomb and brainwash the teenagers. That is what the troubled teen industry, if you've heard of it, Paris
Oh,
Hilton, the
yes.
prison camp she was sent to, like that's what that is. When children are isolated and only taught one way of thinking and only exposed to one way of being in the world, that is a very different term. And, trigger warning, it's a harsh term, but it's called mind rape, right? And that is something very specific. And we can also see that brainwashing on adults is very effective. It's like 98% effective.
Wow.
Brainwashing, if you want to call what happened to me growing up brainwashing, it's less than 50-50 on children that are raised in this way growing up and staying with the cult, right? And right now we are seeing people walking away from this kind of stuff at a huge rate.
And is
So
that due to the internet?
in large part, yes. The internet really is breaking a lot of the OG cults that were heavily reliant on isolation, and I actually think the Children of God was kind of the canary in the coal mine here, because we had
Oh, okay.
only 10,000 members, and it went along pretty strong for 40 years. But then they wanted to use the internet to reach more people, because cults are about labor, right? Selling on the internet and all of this stuff, but it actually gave us access, right? So it was possible for me to leave and even think about the outside world at 15. Whereas for my mom at 15 in the Philippines, having a baby in a cult commune with no access to the outside world, much, much more difficult. And the way that cults die is when they fail to keep or recruit the next generation. And that is happening with some of these really big cults, like the Mormons, for example, right? It's just that they're so big, they haven't reached that tipping point yet. The Children of God reached that tipping point in 2009, and that was when it
Two
kind of dispersed.
What happened in 2009?
Well, okay, so first of all, in 1996, the leader died. And Children of God is considered to be one of these cults that successfully passed down a cult of personality. I disagree with that. We had a theory of prophecy that anyone could just talk to heaven, And so what she did is actually called charisma by proxy. Like, he's still the leader. I'm still talking to him every day. He's telling me what to do.
Wow.
And it just went on for another 12 years. But in 2009, I believe, and my grandfather is still the finance guy of what's left, so I have a little insight
Wow.
here, that they realized, like, all of their initial cult joiners from the 60s and 70s were aging out of being able to beg on the streets for 12 hours a day,
Yeah.
and the children were not staying. Most of us have huge families. I have 25 siblings in sex cult
Oh my
math. And the majority of us were not staying, especially the ones on the younger end that had more access to the outside world. And so in 2009, they changed their mission. They said, "You know what? We know we've said that for 40 years Jesus is coming back any day now, but Jesus told us he might not be coming back in our lifetime anymore." And that was when the cult just kind of disintegrated. Now, very interestingly, I think we have a big national cult that's going through that same thing, that slashed their mission, and now it's sort of bleeding out.
25 siblings. What is your relationship like with your family members?
I'm very close to a few of them, but I would say that, you know, my family basically doesn't really know how to be a family. That's kind of what cults do. Many of
Right.
them, all of all cults that I have seen use familial language. It's one of the things I talk about in the book. Our cult renamed themselves the family. And,
I see.
growing
Well,
up,
that's
we
not a red
were
flag.
I like to say anything that calls itself your family wants to overwork you, underpay you, and expect you to put up with more BS than you would otherwise. And, we grew up, most of us in the same place as our parents, but I saw my mom for 1 hour a day. We were living in dorms, working all the time, and taught to not be close to our own individual families. So, we have to build those relationships on the outside. I have a very close relationship with my mom, who's no longer in the cult and who
Oh, wow.
has really done well by all of her children. But I'm definitely not close to 25 siblings. And I would also say when you're the one that chooses to spill the family secrets, you get invited to Thanksgiving a little less. It is hard for everyone. So I try not to talk about my siblings other than to just say they exist because I want them all to have their own journeys.
Fair enough. Yeah. And it might have been, I think, easier, but in some ways, because you were born into the cult and did not come under your own volition, maybe to leave, but also harder because where most folks may be abandoning their family when they're joining a cult, you were abandoning your family by leaving a cult.
Yeah, and that makes it really, really hard. And it's even one of the discussions I did have to have with my mom afterwards that, because she said, "But when you said you wanted to leave, we helped you." And I said, "I mean, thank you for helping me. Thank you for not shunning me. But at 15 years old, I had to make the decision to never see my family again, potentially, to leave
Yeah.
everything that I knew." And I mean, I was dropped into Houston with a stepsister I didn't know into a 4,000 kid school.
That
And,
was my next question. Wow.
my first thought on my first day of school was like, "Oh, I'm from another planet."
Yeah.
I grew up all around the world, so thinking of myself as from another country was kind of what I had done, but I was like, "No, I'm from another planet." Like, I don't know how to function at all in the world. And, scholars and therapists say that leaving a cult is one of the closest things we can imagine to death, just
Yeah.
absolutely losing everything.
I mean, you're, excommunicated, shunned in certain ways. I mean, that's super brave. Did you have a choice? I know there was an incident. Was was that deliberate in some respects subconsciously on your part? Like,
It was
what
definitely
what
deliberate. I think I had my crack in the brainwashing was on 9/11. It was the first time I saw live television news.
wow.
I was 14 years old, and I'm hearing the people around me, like, praising God for his judgment on evil America, and then I hear the term religious extremists, and that was a lot of times people in cults think that it's them, not the cult. And this was my moment of being like, "Oh, are we the baddies?" And I knew I didn't wanna be there. I never wanted to be there. I was always planning to get out and go be a lawyer, ironically, which I never did. But so from the age of 14, I started kind of my rebellious campaign to get myself thrown out. And I ultimately would, very dramatically climb over the commune walls to go see a boy, fellowship with an outsider. And I was gonna be excommunicated. And the thing is that cults will always like, the worst sin is leaving. So they will always accept you back if you grovel, if you are willing to just lay yourself open to the group, take whatever punishment, which was extreme. It was 6 months of hard labor and reindoctrination and isolation. And I was thinking about it because I was 15 and scared, and maybe I just go to my grandparents' commune in India and everything's better. And this was when my mom, like, took me on a walk outside the walls and was just like, "Go. Like, I see you. You're not happy. Go."
Your mom was really helpful then. I was gonna ask if you forgive your parents, but it sounds like your mom was really helpful in ushering you into a different path.
So I have forgiven my mom. She's one of only 2 adults in the cult that I have forgiven. The other one is not my dad. And I have kind of a thing about forgiving ex-cult members that I would like to share, which is you don't get forgiven just for leaving the cult. We're happy you left the cult, but you don't get forgiven just for that. The reason I have completely forgiven my mom, first of all, she was born in it too, and I really understand what that means. But she has given me a full, unmitigated apology for everything that I went through in my childhood and told each of her 8 children that they can talk about it with her no matter what, and if she has feelings, she will deal with those feelings herself and with her therapist. She has done the work, like done the work to deconstruct, done the work to understand, and then she's like in the fight, helping fight back against the cult.
Wow.
And famously said to my dad once when he was asking her, "What's your dad gonna think about Daniella's book?" And said, "If I have to pick between my dad and my daughter, I'm gonna choose my daughter,"
Wow.
which is definitely not what we were taught growing up, what
Yeah.
was the thing. So it's like you really need to do the work outside the cult and understand that the people who were the victims of the cult, like, don't really owe you forgiveness. But yeah, my mom and I have a very strong relationship, and we've
That's
spent
great to
about a decade together deconstructing and reading books and kind of doing all this work.
And how old was she when she left?
She was 39. She had a medical emergency with a child, and this is also a trend of when people will have their cracks in the brainwashing with a medical emergency, either for themselves
Okay.
or a child. And they were living in Mexico. She had a child with spina bifida. The cult really did not like medical care, like most cults. And, she kept being told everything was fine with her child and everything was not fine. And so she was like, "That's it. Got on a plane to Houston to the children's hospital." And then from there told my dad she wasn't coming back and he needed to bring the other 5 children. And
Wow.
that was kind of how they left. And it was as the cult was falling apart.
And what was her deprogramming like compared to yours? I mean, she had 25 additional years of being in the cult.
Yeah, I think first of all, our relationship became very not mother-daughter because I was much more the mentor,
Wow.
and one of the things I told her was like, "Mom, it's gonna take you a decade. It's gonna take you a decade to get on your feet, to get an education, figure out with the kids, figure out jobs." And, now I call it the decade of deconstruction, and I've actually built a workbook that goes with my newest book that
Alright.
people can work through to, like, deconstruct the worldview and the pseudo identity you've been forced to have, you know? And my mom really thought of herself as a true believer her whole life, but
Yeah.
I don't know that children being forced can be true believers, you know? And she was kind of questioning for a long time, just not letting those questions get all the way through. But yeah, being out in the world for the first time, 39 with 6 children still at home, one of them severely handicapped, one of them a newborn baby. It was very, very challenging.
And you left a cult and arguably joined another cult, the US Army. What was your path between, the ages of 15 when you left and the time that you joined the Army?
Yeah, so I put myself through 4 years of high school in 2 years. I put myself through college, working 4 jobs, graduated valedictorian. I look back now and I see that I just built myself a high demand, high control environment so that I couldn't think about my trauma. I was very, very scared of going off the rails, in the other direction. And I was like, all the things that the cult told you. You're gonna just be a drug addict, you're gonna be working at McDonald's, you're not gonna be in, receiving God's blessing. And I was like, no, I will show them all. And then I probably very unsurprisingly fell into a relationship in college that I would call a 1-1 cult, and got married way too young, and then sort of realized I was gonna be stuck as an army spouse and thought, "You know what? Maybe I'll go in too." And, I look back now again and was like, I had just failed at the world. Like, I don't think I would have known what to do, like, to go find a job, to make friends, to integrate. College, you still kind of have a system that's taking care
Yeah.
of you a little bit. And the Army sounded great. Military intelligence sounded like something I'd be really good at, understanding a whole different culture and putting yourself in their shoes, like, basic skill. And I speak a bunch of languages, and I was like, "Yeah, why not?" You know? And I think I was really looking forward to a summer at basic training of not having to think. And this is why cults pop up in times of social turmoil. Clarity,
Interesting.
And I was just like, the Army tells you all you gotta do to be successful is be in the right place, in the right time, in the right uniform, and never volunteer for anything, right? Don't stand out. That's a little bit impossible if you're a woman or a person of color or anything other than a straight white tall man, but, I really threw myself into it and tried my hardest and excelled until I didn't, as it goes with high demand groups.
I mean, you achieved the rank of captain, so you did something
Mhm.
right.
Yep. Yep. But, I mean, it was fun. It was fun. The Army was fun, for people who don't fit in. I often say that I think the military is kind of like the circus used to be for, like, all the kids that don't fit in their hometown. For one reason or another, you can go off and join the Army, and they will teach you everything you need to know, and they will give you the rule book and what to wear and the rank and the structure, and a lot of us can get by in that
I mean,
for a long
it's a
time.
comforting place, and I know a little bit about it. I was in the Army as I went to West Point, and
Oh,
I lasted for basically the basic training piece beast before West Point begins, and I was kind of on the opposite spectrum in that I was self-disciplined in my own way and didn't like authority, and I removed myself after a few months. Still have a great respect for the military, but I can understand how it's there's comfort in being told what to do. There's comfort
yep,
in discipline, and I wasn't a seeker at that point, whereas you describe people who are susceptible to cult as having a seeker personality or being at that point in their life. What's
yeah.
that like? Were you at that point? Were you a seeker at that time?
I was definitely both, right? Because I am like you, that I've always questioned authority. I hate to be told what to do. Like, this is part of why I never fit into the cult. But I knew how to turn that off, right? So that's why, like, my first thought after, "Oh, I joined another cult in basic training," was like, "Okay, fine. I'm gonna be better at it than these suckers." Right? Because I know how to just tamp down my individuality and just go through it,
Yeah,
and I'm sure they do something similar at West Point, but in basic training, which is where the prologue of my first book, Uncultured, opens up, they have this thing. So first of all, you have a week of reception, right? Which is the same thing they call it in prison. And during this week, you have no idea what's going on. You're just standing in lines and sitting in lines and doing lots of push-ups, and they are getting your uniforms and getting your ID card, and they're kind of systematically dehumanizing you and putting you into the machine. And then you get on the bus with this 50-pound duffel bag with all your gear and you go to basic training. And the first thing that happens is they just start yelling at you. And you got to get that bag up in the air. And you're going to hold it there for 2 to 3 hours. And this is when I had this realization, oh, this is a cult, right? We're very obviously playing a game here. There is a purpose for this. And the purpose is what I call wacky rituals. And there's two important things about this duffel bag game, which is it's impossible, right? Nobody can hold 50 pounds up in the air for 2 or 3 hours. And the second is it's irrational. Nobody who's not been in the military has just decided to go out and hold a bunch of weight up in the air. I mean, maybe CrossFit, but and there's research that shows that once you do the first wacky thing for a group that you have voluntarily joined, you're very much more likely to do it again, and to not complain. And sure enough, like that is the event where either you just push through and you just decide you're in it, or you go home that night and they call you failure to adapt, and you're just like, "Nope,
wow.
I made a mistake. I'm out." And I can just do it, childhood of being tortured and being in groups and lines, and a soldier forgot. I was like, "Yeah, this is not hard."
Yeah,
Being not an individual is not hard. The number one thing people complain about in basic training is lack of privacy, which is one of the fastest ways to break you, constant surveillance. Like,
right.
I'd never even gone anywhere by myself till I was almost 16 years old, so lack of privacy didn't phase
You
me.
grew up in a dorm. It's like
Yeah,
barracks.
mhm.
So let me ask you, are there good cults?
Another thing that there's disagreement on, but in my mind and in my model, that's a very strong no. And I understand the desire for it. And, that amount of motivation, that amount of community and connection. I mean, it's so great that when people leave cults, they spend the rest of their lives searching for that.
Yeah,
But, when people ask me if they can have good cults, I like to rephrase it, maybe from an organizational psychology perspective, and say, you're asking if you can have an unhealthy amount of motivation and labor out of people for your good cause. And there's 2 points on my 10-point checklist. One, number 4, is constant self-sacrifice, which is how they break you. Like, that's the whole how they break you. And I think that always harms individuals. And number 8, which is exploitation of labor, which I don't think can be good.
and what was your labor like as a child in the Children of God? Like, what was a typical day for you?
So we, as the children, we did, like, I would say the majority of the labor to keep the commune going, right? So every day we would wake up at 6 or 7, we would have a few hours of devotions, singing and praising God and reading stuff. And then it was Jesus job time, JJTs, when the children from the age of 3 basically were cleaning and scrubbing and washing and cooking and just all of the things. But also, every cult usually has a product. And the Children of God's product originally was religious prostitution. That's how they got in the news a lot. But when that turned badly for them, they became an entertainment cult. This is why we produce so many actors. So I was, in addition to all the physical labor, I was a singing, dancing child actor for God. And they had an army of 7,000 of us, right, that would sing and dance and perform. This is one of the things about the Children of God. It was very extreme. It was communes. It was all of that. But we were also trafficked in front of the whole world. And performance is actually really, really a brilliant way to traffic children because nobody looks at smiley, shiny,
Right.
bouncing, dancing children and says, are they being taken care of? Do they want to be there? Do they even know they have a choice? All that to say, my most recent project is I have written a musical called Cult Baby, the musical, veterans included. And I'm really excited
I love
about
it.
taking all that back. And I think the only thing more theater kids than theater kids is evangelical performing kids.
I was about to ask if you still performed and sang, and I guess that question has been answered. So when is this production when's it coming out? How far along are you?
I mean, we're gonna see, for sure the reason I've built a giant brand on social media is because I'm good at performing and just talking and knitting, and people don't necessarily see it that way. But the interesting thing that I'm trying to figure out is everybody who follows me wants to be in the musical. All of the cult babies and all of the veterans want to be in it. Cult Baby the musical already has a cult following, and we are trying to figure out how we use this energy and talent of the audience without exploiting anyone's labor.
Yeah, I was gonna say free labor.
Right, no, and I have a very strong no free labor value, and I'm, like, batting away ex-Mormon music labor, like, "No, you can't write songs for me for free." But one of the things that I did was so first of all, there's this video, you can watch it on YouTube, you Google "family fun end time rap," and it is me and 6 other white children rapping apocalypse Bible verses in downtown Rio, and I absolutely had to reuse that and take that back, and
Too good.
then I realized I was going to take a whole bunch of my dad's music, who had written just absolute bops for the children of God, and then we'd sold millions of them around the world. So I've taken a bunch of the cult's music and added it to my musical. So, for example, in the first half, which is about cults, we have heaven's girls and heaven's boys making such a joyful noise. Real line from the cults. But then my army basic training song, which is called Drink the Kool-Aid, is armies, girls, and armies, boys, quit making such an awful noise. And we go from there.
It sounds like you have a wealth of material to pull from, which is great. You've got some
And
good problems to have.
this whole thing is like, it's a performance that cults are about performance. All cults, whether they actually do out loud performances or not, it's all about performing. And in fact, one of my favorite cult terms is a horizontal power structure where everyone is watching everyone else. So self-surveillance and auto surveillance of others. And it's called performative regulation. We're only doing this because other people are watching and we're all keeping each other under control.
Not knowing that the person standing next to you might be having the same doubtful thoughts.
That's exactly right. And there's a thing called social proof that is very
Yeah.
important there. And the Children of God had a very good example of this. So when I was a young teenager, the new lady in charge came out with this doctrine called loving Jesus. And it was about having spiritual sex with Jesus.
Hmm.
And yep, just out loud spiritual orgies, probably a word you never thought you would hear.
No.
And they sent out a very, very specific rule, was that nobody was allowed to read it, this 12-part series, for the first time by themselves, right? So if you were the adult not in the room for the group devotions because you were watching the kids, you couldn't catch up on this like you could with other things. You had to read it in the presence of someone else. And that is exactly
Smart.
because if you read it by yourself, you would probably be like, nah, this is crazy.
You'd be
But
like,
if you read
WTF.
it with other people whom you respect, whom you know are good people, right, all around you, and nobody else is saying anything, you
You're
are
apt to
so much
listen.
more likely to go along with it, right?
Yeah.
Because, we think of ourselves as rational humans, but we're not. We make almost all of our decisions based on recency bias, what has worked for us most recently,
Mm.
and social proof, what everyone else around us is doing. The answer to if your friends jumped off a cliff, would you, is like yes for 98% of.
Yeah. I mean, even smart people, are they susceptible to cults as much as anybody else?
Absolutely. And you know what? There's this kind of stereotype that you only join cults if you're stupid or poor, but like cults want high performers just like everyone else. And
Yeah,
smart people are really good at making arguments for things they want to believe. And so you can
I see.
argue yourself into anything. And then they're great at going out and converting other people. So
Right.
having these go-getters at the front of your call, at the front of your force is exactly. And I always tell people like a Harvard educated lawyer died on the side of the Branch Davidians in Waco. Like
Right.
it's not about intelligence at all.
And you described it as the Children of God as a sex cult, and we've seen that over and over again. What exactly is a sex cult, and how did it work in the Children of God?
So a sex cult is definitely a made up definition by the media. There's also a saying that all cults are sex cults, which I kind of agree with. The children of God, right? You could not be in the children of God without knowledge of their weird sexual beliefs. Basically, what David Berg did was he took regular evangelicalism of his mom was a revivalist preacher in the 1930s, and he took like the control of sex, the purity, and he flipped it. And he called it free love, and I call it forced polyamory. And then he
Yeah.
came around with this doctrine to raise sexually liberated children. And they created what has been called the worst cult artifact of all times, which is a 762-page how-to book on pedophilia that he played out on his stepson through his young wife, who was created by the religious prostitution and then raised to be this fully sexualized child. So, the other cult that gets called a sex cult is Keith Raniere's Nexium. However, it was possible to be a member of Nexium and not have any awareness of the crazy sexual goings on of Nexium. It was not at all possible, and any adult that says they didn't know about the sexual abuses of the children of God is just lying,
Wow.
because the sexual part of it was the big differentiator. Very similar to like the Mormons with polygamy.
And people didn't question this. I mean, a 700-page door stopper on
Yeah.
child
I
sexual
mean,
exploitation.
so this exactly this what you just did is how I came up with my part 2 of cults, which is sacred assumption. And very dramatically just sat up in the middle of the night and was like, "Oh, hold nothing sacred." And every high control group has like this one thing that you have to believe to be a member in good standing. So I say in the Children of God, it was that this man, this random white dude from California, was the prophet of God. And so anything that he does, which jumps down to point 10 of my cult list, ends justifies the means. Anything that he does is justified because he's the prophet of God. In the
How
US
convenient.
military, I think it is that dying for the American flag is worth it. Right? If you don't believe that, you're not going to do very well in
Yeah.
the army. And that is exactly because you have to push yourself past all of this crazy stuff. And then the other thing is they never roll it out all at once. This is how I don't let other cult scholars tell me I'm crazy about the military, because all of us who joined the military understand that, like, we didn't know what we were signing up for. There was so much bait and switch kind of in the training process. I got a year and a half into training as a military intelligence officer. And there's two parts of that job when you go to war. There's the collect all the information to keep our guys safe. And then there's this thing called targeting, which was mentioned once in school, which is, here, go kill this person. And I had no idea how big of a part of my job that was going to be until I was deployed to Afghanistan, at which point there's absolutely nothing I can do about it. And I think that was on purpose. I think they do these things on purpose. So keeping it separate, rolling it out a little bit at a time. And, David Berg's sexual proclivities didn't start coming out until he'd been around for about a decade and had 10,000 people in these armies doing his calling, you know. And I also just always have to make a point here that purity culture is the other side of the coin of pedophilia culture. So I think we are all starting to see now with the Epstein list and Christian nationalism and all of this stuff that sexual abuse was always a part of it, and ours was just out loud.
And you talk about how there's different rules for the leader.
Yeah, so and this is where purity requirements become very important to understand. And by purity, I don't just mean sexual purity. I literally mean any absolute rules about behavior, dress codes, food, right? Like any version of I don't do X, right? We did not read books from the outside world. We did not listen to music from the outside world. We did watch movies from the outside world because our founder liked movies, but they were very
Okay.
controlled, And so, like, my musical is based off of The King and I and The Sound of Music and Brigadoon and, all of these like ancient things. That is what I was raised on. And purity requirements are really, really good for cults because humans are really bad at being pure and perfect. So it keeps you in this mode of constantly striving. And by the way, I don't drink alcohol at all. Alcoholics Anonymous, like, that is also a purity requirement. And the cult leader, though, never has to follow their own purity requirements. So David Koresh of Waco made all of the other adult men be celibate while he slept with and impregnated their wives. Keith Raniere, same, was preaching celibacy or monogamy while he was running a harem. In the Children of God, we did not drink alcohol or smoke at all. My dad, who ran the finances until he died of lung cancer from chain smoking, and David Berg was an alcoholic his whole life. So
And
the rules never apply to the cult leader.
that doesn't surprise me. What surprises me is that people would just not question that.
And this goes back to, well, in Christian traditions, it's called the King David defense, which is basically King David from the Bible, who was unarguably a horrible, terrible person, but was used by God, was chosen by God. We've seen this a lot applied to our current president, and that's kind of how they go. It's like the cult leader is not perfect, but he's God's chosen vessel. And this is, with Keith Raniere, it wasn't religious. And he said crazy things, like he had the highest IQ ever tested and he was a concert pianist. And neither of those things could he back up. But because of this sacred assumption that he's the smartest man in the world, in this case, like, people didn't question. And this is also where the skinny white woman comes in, which is one of my signature things that I've added to the cult world. And it is, if I were to put up a series of photos of like famous cult leaders right now, across the board, they're basically just flubs. The survivors of NXIVM are really upset that in a movie about NXIVM, they chose an attractive man to play Keith Raniere, because Keith Raniere is the most ridiculous looking, sounding, acting human being you've kind of ever seen, right? But the cult leader is not usually the one pulling the people in. It's the skinny white woman. And, I really coined this term watching NXIVM with Allison Mack and then Ghislaine Maxwell with the Epstein
Epstein, yeah.
list.
Yeah.
And, because of very specifically America's brand of white supremacy, white women who look like me, are pure and perfect and chaste and never the bad guys and not scary. And so it is essentially a validity mascot, right? And we also see money and fame standing in for that. And we also see military officers standing in for that. Plus, if they're also skinny white women, like in the orgasm cult, one taste, but it's basically this but look, she's here, right? So
Right.
if she's going along with it, they're definitely not abusing and trafficking children. Meanwhile, one of the things I write about in Uncultured is that my mom, at the age of 13, was part of this ceremony where the 75-year-old cult leader married 14 girls ranging from age 3 to age 14, including his own daughter and granddaughter. And the 3-year-old's mom ran the ceremonies. And the 3-year-old's mom, before she joined the cult, was a Dallas Cowboys cheerleader.
Wow.
Just your typical skinny white woman, And I mean, this woman ran child programs all around the world for 25 years, or
Wow.
40 years, actually, without anyone ever looking closely at her because she was just a nice lady.
I see.
She's
Wow.
the one who
Wow.
wrote the pedophilia book and also was the main nanny of the child doing the things, right? So she is one of the worst people in this entire cult. She's a pretty white lady who smiles.
What happened to her?
She's still out there. They just
Oh,
recently got her kids program in Costa Rica shut down by contacting authorities and telling her who they were. But one of the things about cults is you usually don't get justice. They usually, unfortunately, get to ride off into the sunset after ruining countless lives.
why is that? I mean, is it possibility that because they are moving to foreign countries that they're able to evade in some ways?
I mean, and the children of God for sure. I always say when things started heating up for cults in the 70s in America, it was very convenient that Jesus told him to move all around the world and change
Yeah.
everybody's names. Right? And in our cases with the children of God, I know the Fleetwood Mac guy's legal name, who was one of my big abusers, Jeremy Spencer of Fleetwood Mac. But mostly, I don't even know the legal names of the people
Right.
who were abusing me. Right? So it's very, very difficult to try to go after it. But this is also where I think that stereotypes of brainwashing really come in. And I see this with the way people talk about cult members, and I see this with the way people talk about soldiers. And it's people think that brainwashing makes you this mindless automaton, and it doesn't. And that's that idea of brainwashing is the best thing that ever happened to cults, because all you have to do is produce these people who sound good and speak well and say, no, of course we never did that. And it goes nowhere, you know? And also, it cannot be stated enough that there was this whole thing in America called the cult wars, which is in the 80s when there was some appetite from the American people for laws against coercive control. Religious leaders decided that they were not going to have that because that would inhibit their own control. And so they went and they found scholars of religion who I strongly believe should stay out of cult scholarship. And so, for example, the man who coined the term new religious movement, Gordon Melton, took $100,000 from the Children of God to say they weren't a cult. And then the children of God used that in 4 countries to get the kids given back to the pedophile cult.
Wow.
So it is all so much more tied up in corruption than I think we really realize. And of course, the last reason too is like most places and most countries in the world have statute of limitations on crimes against children, and that is really something we need to work on. One of the only times we have gotten some justice from the children of God is when Scotland repealed their statute of limitation on crimes against children. And so
Shouldn't
two
be one in the first
two
place.
people were be able to be pursued. But it's like, I was horribly, horribly abused from a very young age, but I wasn't ready to do anything about it till I was about 35, you
Yeah.
know? And they're just it is just too impossible to go after people. But I do have the advice for anyone who wants to try to go after their cult. Don't go after them for the sexual abuse. Unfortunately, nobody cares. Go after them for exploitation of labor, right? Like, go
Wow.
after their money. Go
Yeah.
after the money you made for them that you should have been paid for.
Wow. It's almost like the, how they went after mobsters, tax evasion.
Exactly. Exactly. I know that the IRS is who took down Al Capone because our cult leader taught us that. 'Cause they're very, like,
Yeah.
focused on that.
Yeah. 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 So in terms of, let's get to leaving cults and how that happens, and you talk about the sunk cost fallacy, and maybe you could describe that and what keeps people in it.
Yeah. I've added this whole section to my book. Everyone talks about exit costs, but I was like, first, we're going to talk about entrance costs because there's so much that you give up, including your friends and family and your connection to yourself and your past and your world that you give up when you leave, when you join a cult. And then, you have to leave. Right. So a lot of people will stay in just because they've already given so much to a cult. A lot of people will stay in because the idea of going back in shame is too hard to handle. So my husband, as a teenager, my current husband, joined the military to be a pilot. And then he originally failed the pilot program by one sit up. And there was no way he was going home in shame. So he was like, okay, I'll be enlisted. I'll go be a helicopter mechanic. And, ultimately worked his way back up and retired as a special operations pilot. But the whole reason he ended up in the military was because he wasn't going to go back home in shame and say I failed. And so that is like a very, very strong thing. And then exit costs are very misunderstood. But I do like to say that any group that says you're free to leave anytime, you're not free, right? Like, when you're free to leave anytime, nobody has to say that. Nobody's ever come up
Right.
to me in Costco and been like, "Hey, ma'am, just you're free to leave anytime." And exit costs are everything that you're gonna lose when you leave
Yeah.
the group. And the most significant exit costs are usually social and psychological. Like,
Yeah.
you lose everyone you knew. And you also lose things like certainty, right? Every cult is telling you in one way or another, this is the way to live life. If you follow all of our rules, if you do all these things, if you're totally pure and perfect, you will have perfection, usually after some space travel. And it's just designed to keep you there, and there's one definition of a cult is that like any group that you cannot leave without losing your dignity.
Wow. I mean, it's almost like a giant security blanket in a way that
Yeah.
envelops your entire existence.
And I also think there's this misunderstanding of leaving a cult or waking up to the brainwashing that it's kind of like leaving prison and you're just going to be like, I'm free. But usually it's not. It's terrifying. People want to fight very hard against the idea that they were manipulated by a con man and wasted their life in a cult and harmed their
Yeah.
children. And so you have a lot of people who refuse to deconstruct or deprogram, and they end up doing what we call cult hopping and just going into other environments the same, sort of like I did with the military.
Yeah. You've called belonging is beautiful and, people need groups. So how do we distinguish between those groups that are helpful to us and our community versus those that are not?
Yeah, I was very jaded by the end of writing this book, and I kind of felt like all groups are the problem. As soon as you
Mm,
define an us, you've defined a them, and maybe our human disease is that us versus them takes over. But I do obviously think like there are good groups. And for me, one of the signs is, first of all, we have to acknowledge that groups are stronger than individuals.
yeah.
That's why we build them. And so if we don't actively guard individuals and prioritize individuals, the group is going to hurt them, even if it's not a cult. And so I say, I want to see, where does the group sometimes lose so that the individuals can succeed. Tylenol doing their recall is one of those very good examples, I think, of choosing to be like, yep, we're going to take a huge hit here, but it's going to be for our values and our customers, et cetera. And usually we don't see groups doing that. The military coming out and saying we're going to protect our service members from being raped instead of caring more about unit cohesion and shutting things down would be an example of that. And finally, I also kind of at the end of the book was like, look, I study bad groups, and the people who create good groups don't usually look like me. So I brought in Rebecca Slew, who's a writer and content creator, and she's a Black woman who goes by White Woman Whisperer. And she contributed a really amazing essay at the end of the book that is about
Yeah.
groups versus community. And that one of the things we've really lost in America, especially in white America, is community. And so we keep bouncing around to these groups, all of which sort of harm us in some way because we don't have strong community. And one of the definitions that she gives that I really think folks relate to is, groups have boundaries of who's in and who's out, but communities are very porous. Communities can expand and contract kind of naturally. And also, anyone in a community can be a leader in a different thing as is necessary versus kind of having one person or one idea as the leader. So I definitely recommend that people look at this essay if they want to know more about good groups. I continue to be the expert on the bad ones.
Well, any final advice for folks considering leaving a cult-like group or those that are looking to find community?
Yeah. So one is, I would say, type in hashtag deconstruction on any social media of your choice, because there's a huge amount of us out here. Like, we know how this process goes. We know what you're going to feel like. We know how to help you. You can come find me, Knitting Cult Lady, on almost any platform, and we're doing this every day. But one of the things I tell people is, much like anywhere that children are cared for, there's going to be abuse. Like, anywhere in the space of there are going to be abusers, right? Abusers are going to show up. Anywhere in the space of personal transformation, predators are going to show up. That can be education, that can be spirituality, that can be diet, exercise, that can be losing a loved one,
Yeah.
moving. So this is why one of the things I did is I didn't write a book that just calls out which groups are cults. It is legitimately a tactics book. It is like, this is
Yeah.
how the bad guys do it. This is how they coerce you. The patterns are the same every time. And what I really care about is not what's labeled a cult. I have a song in the musical that is, call it what you want to, call it what you want to. But these are the tactics. This is how they do
Yeah.
it.
I almost feel like in some ways that I wouldn't want your book to get into the wrong hands because it's almost a playbook for how to start a cult.
I think that's true, but I also think that, all the cult leaders and tyrants, they study each other, but they have this one flaw, and I call it sampling the Kool-Aid, which is they don't listen to their intelligence officers. They don't think about how they can be taken down and how it can go wrong for them. But also, I'm not gonna not give the map to help people deconstruct
Yeah.
just because bad guys are gonna use it. That's a thing about security policy. Like, as soon as you come up with a new thing, people are going to be using it and for
Yeah.
bad purposes, but we still do the good stuff anyway.
Sure do. Well, thank you for your work. Thank you for writing this book. It's called The Culting of America: What Makes a Cult and Why We Love Them. Daniella, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks so much.
All Across America is produced by me, Marco Vig, in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Visit us on Instagram at All Across America. Check out our website, allacrossamerica.com. There's an interactive map with all our episodes, and there's a Contact Us page where you can send your reactions, guest ideas, and suggestions. So get in touch, stay connected. To me, that's what podcasting is all about. Thanks for listening.